Hi everyone, I have a few more things that I needed to talk about before I continue with part 2 of my analysis of the I Pet Goat movie. I wanted to talk a little bit about the word hand in the Hebrew because it's very important in understanding this imagery over here. And so it's really interesting that we had this Google Doodle a couple of days ago in light of what I've been talking about concerning the I Pet Goat movie, because as I've mentioned many times before, there's always a true and a false. And so this seems to be depicting the Antichrist system, because the very first thing that I thought about when I saw this Google Doodle with all the ones and the zeros, I thought that it looked like a barcode. And that was before I even realized that it was on a scroll. And then once I noticed that, he's using his hand to make a mark or an etch over here. It's just a little etch, basically, is what he's making with the point of the pen. And so I realized that this imagery is depicting the mark of the beast. Because if you look at the word mark in the Greek in Revelation 13:16 through 18 is where it talks about the mark of the beast. And I'll look at the one here in verse 17 where it says, "And that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name." And so if you look at the word mark in the Greek, it's the word haragma. And as I've mentioned many times before, this word means an etch or scratch is basically what it means. It implies a sharp point because it comes from this word, harax, which means a pale or stake or palisade. So the implication is that it's made with a sharp point, and then it comes from this word over here, which is the word grapho. It's the word that you get graph from, and that actually means to write. And writing back then actually was done with the use of a sharp point, just as you see with this imagery over here. And then I've already talked about what the role of a scroll represents. It's basically the sixth seal, as you can see from these images over here, which is talked about in Revelation 6:14, where it says the heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island were removed from its place. It's also talked about in Isaiah 34:4, where it says all the stars in the sky will fade away, the sky will roll up like a scroll, all its stars will wither like a leaf withers and falls from a vine, or a fig tree withers and falls from a tree. I've also talked about how it's basically the same imagery that you have in Ezekiel 2:8 and Revelation 10:8. In Ezekiel 2:8, you have a representation of Ezekiel eating the little book, and in Revelation 10:8, you have John eating the little book, and a hand is extended out to him. So it's basically the same imagery that's being described in both Ezekiel 2 and Revelation 10. And in both cases, you have the number 8, which I believe represents the year 2018. And so what I've realized is that Ezekiel represents the bride, just as I've mentioned before that John represents the bride in Revelation, in the book of Revelation, because he's the one that God told to come up hither in Revelation 4:1, where it says, "After this I looked, and behold, a door was open in heaven, and the first voice which I heard was as it were of a trumpet talking with me, which said, Come up hither, and I will show you the things which must be hereafter." It was also John that Jesus said, when Peter asked him, he said, "What about him, Lord?" And Jesus answered and said, "If I want him to remain until I return, what is that to you? You follow me." So over here we're told that John remains until the end, just like the remnant. And so it's the remnant that are caught up to heaven, as you see in 1 Thessalonians 4:16 through 18. It says, "For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so shall we ever be with the Lord. Wherefore comfort one another with these words." And this comes up in 1 Thessalonians 14:16 through 18. So again, you have the number 18. Okay, so you always have a true and a false. And so I want to get back to this I Pet Goat movie, because I want to explain how this is a representation of the rapture. As I've mentioned before, this is the most important part of the movie, but it just so happened that this Google Doodle came up, and so I wanted to talk about this as well, because this is a representation of the false. This is a representation of how the Antichrist is going to carry out his plan, and as always, he copies God with everything. And so I've talked about the word hand and what that represents. And like I said, I'll explain that a little more, because I want to talk about the word tenons, because that goes back to my last video that I did, which I want to explain a little more. But it also refers to a phallus, as it states here. And so the scroll relates to the roll of a book. It's basically the word Megillah, as you can see here. It talks about the roll of a book in Ezekiel 2:9, where it says, "And when I looked, behold, a hand was sent unto me, and lo, a roll of a book was therein." And if you look at the word roll, you see that it's the word Megillah in the Hebrew. And so I've shown the images of that. A Megillah is usually rolled into one roll, as opposed to the scroll or the Torah, which is rolled up into two rolls. But a Megillah is rolled up into one, such as the book of Esther, which I believe is what it talks about in this image over here. It shows Esther's scroll. So that was rolled up into one book. And in the Greek, as I've mentioned before, it's Strong's number 2777. It's a form of the word head. It means little head, but it also means the tips or knobs of the wooden rod around which parchments were rolled were called by this word because they resembled little heads. And so I've shown this image over here of what that would look like. Okay, so there's always a true and a false. We also have this imagery, which I talked about before in my I Pet Goat analysis part 1, which is where I left off. And what's being represented over here is actually the same thing as what's being represented over here, because this word right here, which is the word kephalis in the Greek, it's also the same as this word, which is kephalidi. It's another way to say the same word, but this word means a little head, as I just showed, or the wooden knobs of the rod that the parchment is rolled on, or the roll of the book itself. But if you look at the definition over here, you see it's the same word. If you look at this definition, which is the Perseus Dictionary, Little and Scott, which is actually supposed to be one of the best dictionaries, and over here it has an additional meaning for this word, and it's the toe cap of a shoe. And so that's what you have illustrated over here. So this is actually Strong's number 2776 is what's being represented right here. And then the next Strong's number that's being represented is 2778, because he's stepping on a coin over here. And if you look at the very next Strong's number, if you look at 2778, you see that it's the word coin. It's the word tribute or census. So it refers to the birth of Jesus, because the one time it was used to mean census was when Jesus was born. And then the other times that it was used, it was referring to paying tribute to Caesar. It was referring to the coin, as you can see here, the coin with which the tax is paid. Okay, it was actually in Luke 2:2 where it used the word census. I was just wondering why it wasn't showing the word census over here in the Blue Letter Bible under the word census, which is Strong's number 2778. If you look at the entries, it doesn't actually show the one in Luke, and so I just wanted to verify that. And as you can see, it's in Luke 2:2 where it uses the word census, but if you look at the interlinear, it's actually a different word in the Greek. It's the word apography, which is interesting because this is the word that charagma comes from, which is the mark of the beast. Okay, so that's the next thing that's being shown right here under this foot with the toe cap, which is Strong's number 2776. So you have 2776 and then 2778 coming right after that. Okay, so that's what you have represented in this Google Doodle. You have the scroll of a book. You have the word graph, which is to write, which is a form of the word census, which is also the term for coin, as in giving tribute to Caesar. And it's also the word from where you get the word charagma, which means mark of the beast. And he's making a mark over here on the paper, which looks like barcodes. And then you also have the word hand, which means phallus. And so this is the method that the Antichrist is going to use. This is what his plan is. Like I said, there's always a true and a false. And his way to accomplish what he wants to do to try to imitate God is through the mark of the beast. And as I've explained before, you can see that over here in Daniel 11:31 is where it says, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." And so if you look at this in the Greek, you see that it says that sperm out of him, it says, "and sperm out of him will resurrect," or be raised up, and will defile the holy of strength, and will metamorph. I'll just show you this word. Okay, just put it in Google Translate, and you can see that it means transformation. Okay, so transform the perpetual, and will give an abomination that is unseen. Okay, you can see that word right here. It means to make unseen, hide, lose sight of, make away with, do away with, remove, disappear, destroy, obliterate, obscure, make away with property, disappear. So it means a number of different things. Okay, and if you look at the word arms in the Hebrew, you'll see that that also means sperm. It comes from the word for sperm or seed. Over here it says arm or forearm or political or military forces, but as you can see, it comes from this word, which is Strong's number 2232, which is the word zara, which means to sow or scatter seed, and then that comes from Strong's number 2233, which is like the number 23 amplified, and that means seed or sowing. And so it comes from the word zera, which means sperm in the Hebrew as well. Okay, so that's the false version. That's the Antichrist plan. But I want to get back to the true version that's described in the Bible and back to the iPet Goat movie. Because there's always a true and a false, and there's a true side to this as well, which is God's plan, which is being depicted at the same time. That's usually how it's described in the Bible. It describes what God's going to do and what the Antichrist is going to do both at the same time. They seem to parallel each other. But I just wanted to share one more thing that relates, and it comes up in Isaiah 8:1, which is number 18 backwards, but it says over here, "The Lord said, take thee a roll and write in it with a man's pen concerning," and then this name over here means, it says it's a symbolic name given by Isaiah by the Lord's direction to Isaiah's son, prophetic indication that Damascus and Samaria were soon to be plundered by the king of Assyria.